Okay, thank you a lot. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for their kind invitation and to express my regret for not being there in person with you. But yeah, so I would like to do it so much, but still I'm here and I would like to share something that just came into my mind while conducting my research on the antagonism between the pagans or pagan Lithuanians and Christians, in particular during the Baltic Crusades. And they think that that was quite curious for me while analyzing the chronicles, specifically those by the Teutonic Order. What was the fate of the Lithuanian prisoners of war during the conflict between the Teutonic Order and Lithuania? When we speak about the Baltic Crusade, I think that I have to introduce it a bit, not going too deep into detail, but it's necessary to emphasize that the entire 13th, 14th century were the period of constant conflicts between the Livonian and Teutonic Order and the pagan neighboring lands, which was called into historiography as Baltic Crusade. And as a part of it, there was a Lithuanian crusade, the conquer of, or the attempts to conquer Lithuanian lands. And later it was not even the crusade in pure understanding of this word, but rather the war between two states, one religious military order, the Teutonic Order, and the forming Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And although the first attacks of the order, Livonian and Teutonic Order, took place in the early 13th century, it was the late 13th century when the attacks of the Teutonic Knights became really large scale. And it was mentioned in Peter of Duisburg's chronicle, who under the year 1283 wrote that the Teutonic Order started its war against Lithuania. And exactly this period, 80s, 90s of the 13th century become the period of constant wars or constant military campaigns, organized, in fact, by both sides, Lithuania and the Teutonic Order. But in this conflict, the attacks of the Teutonic Order were predominant. And obviously, the war, and this is just to demonstrate that it was a really large-scale conflict that took place in this period, in this chronological framework. And that is why, in fact, I've decided to focus on this specific time during today's presentation. There were numerous attacks organized by the brothers to different Lithuanian territories and castles, including Kalaina, Unigeda, and so on and so forth. We won't obviously discuss all these campaigns, but this is just to prove that this period was a period of constant warfare committed by the Teutonic Knights against the Lithuanians. And in the late 90s, early 14th century, there were at least 20 such large-scale attacks, even not to speak about something less important or less significant. Obviously, while thinking of warfare and war, we should understand that each war is usually accompanied by killing people and also taking captivity or captives or prisoners of war. And obviously, I'm not the first person paying attention to such a thing. And during the preparation for today's presentation, in fact, I was inspired by the similar studies that were conducted by such researchers as Sven Atfel or Alvydas Nikžentaitis or Kurt Vilats Jensen or Antanas Petrionis, who paid their attention to different aspects of crusaders and prisoners of war during this conflict in both broader context, Baltic region in general, or Lithuanian case in particular. But the thing is that they paid attention mostly to the later period, to the 14th and specifically to the 15th century, which can be explained by the much more or much better provision of the data preserved in the sources when it comes to that period, because from the mid-14th century, the description of the captives, of the prisoners of war changes significantly, and we have a lot of detail in this respect. And this is something that was discussed, for instance, by Antanas Petrionis in his last year's PhD dissertation defended in Lithuania. And in fact, he discussed the Lithuanian prisoners of war, during this conflict in the 15th century. However, the 13th century and the status, the fate, or treatment of prisoners of war in the 13th century is still an issue that should be analyzed. And I would move on with the statement that I found in Petrionis' thesis, that although the circumstances of capture of Order's members varied, we learn more only about this fact and not about his subsequent fate. And although today we are going to discuss the fate of Lithuanians rather than the Teutons, I would definitely agree with this statement, because we have a lot of descriptions of taking Lithuanian prisoners during the battles between the Order and Lithuanians, but we do not have any specific details concerning their further fate, specifically if we talk about the chronicles. If to analyze the battles and their consequences, we can differentiate between four major outcomes of such campaigns. So first of all, the chronicles usually point out that the land is devastated or the enemies are killed, and of course it's accompanied with looting, but taking captives is also a very important and significant element of warfare. So, and to prove it, I would just refer to Yeroshin's chronicle, who mentions that during the attack Sedovia, they killed and captured 600 people and moved about the area and devastated it and killed and razed forests and plundered. And in fact, in this short fragment, we have all four elements that accompany the warfare between the Teutonic Order and Lithuanians. And it's also important to emphasize that in the majority of cases, it was emphasized that the enemies, including civilians, were primarily killed first, and only then, like secondly, they could take in prisoners in terms of the 13th century. So, for instance, discussing the siege of the castle Bizan in 1283, the chronicle mentions that they attacked the castle ceaselessly, and many of the defenders were shot or seriously wounded. And finally, the Order knights or troops managed to capture the castle and burn it to ashes. And some people who were inside were captured, taken away as prisoners, while the others were killed. So, and again, it was accompanied by destruction and devastating the land. So if we analyze the chronicles, and today it's just a kind of outline of a broader discussion on the issue, we can differentiate between following categories of prisoners. So first of all, they were knights who were fighting against the brothers. However, they were primarily killed, and only the most crucial participants of the events could be taken prisoners. They were obviously and primary civilians, citizens, and there were also some local leaders or nobles who could be taken captivities. And as I've already mentioned, the knights or soldiers, warriors who were fighting back the Teutons, they were primarily killed, and only some men from the locals were taken prisoners, and they emphasized that primarily women and children were taken prisoner and taken away. So as we can see in this fragment, many heathens were sent to their death. However, the master decided that the women and children were to be taken prisoner and taken away. And then they continued the battle, and they killed and took prisoner many of the heathens. And here I would like just to emphasize that in this case, killing and taking prisoners usually went alongside. However, one may ask themselves a question: is it possible to count an approximate number of Lithuanian prisoners of war? Because in the majority of cases, we do not have or do not possess exact numbers, but we have rather multas captivas or many prisoners. And although in some cases we have these specific numbers, as for instance, during the campaign to the lands of Unigeda in 1291, when 700 of heathen men and women were taken captives, or 70 women and children were taken prisoners in 1294. However, not all campaigns are described with the data, with the specific numbers when it comes to the chronicles. Moreover, not all these prisoners of war managed to get to their final destination, and sometimes the Lithuanians took revenge campaigns and escaped their captives. Some of them could die on their way, and everything, something else could have happened. So to answering this question, or to answer this question, would be probably a speculation, although sometimes such attempts, of course, are made. Tracing further fate and conditions in which the prisoners of war were kept. So here it should be emphasized that in terms of the 13th century, it's really quite difficult to say definitely how they were or what the conditions of their captivity were. We can possess the fragmental source materials, as well as make some analogies from the later period, from the 14th, 15th century, and we can think of duration of captivity, which could vary depending on the status of the prisoners of war, and it could be from a month to long-term or long-term period. Of course, we could think of cases of killing of captivities, or even cases of sacrifices of prisoners of war to win the following battles. Anyway, the thing that is unquestionable is that the conditions were not favorable enough. They were quite poor, and probably only the noble prisoners of war could count on more or less good conditions of their preservation, although in some cases their relatives should have sent the provision to for their captivity. And if to face the purpose of the captivity. So here we could differentiate between different aims, including forced physical labor and exploitation, and obviously their conversion pressures in terms of need for being baptized. And in this case, one can even speak about the use of prisoners as leverage for spreading Christianity, or use of prisoners for political negotiations and ransom. Obviously, when it comes to the noble prisoners of war. Obviously, there were some cases of execution of captured warriors, which are not that detailed documented, but we still can assume that. And the only thing that is not that well traced in terms of the chronicles analysis is obviously their integration into Christian society. So how large scale it was and to what degree it was possible. So it's still quite a debatable issue, and it probably was to some degree possible for those who were baptized and who became the members of the order, for instance. And obviously we have lack of time today, but I would provide you just several examples of how the fate of the prisoners of war were traced in the chronicles. So, for instance, the prisoners of war could be used for ransom. And in fact, it was quite an interesting fragment described under the year 1286, where a Lithuanian called Pelus left Lithuania and went to Königsberg because he had a conflict with a local prince and he wanted to take a revenge with the help of the Teutons. And the Teutonic Knights took advantage of Lithuanians celebrating a marriage, and when, according to their custom, they had so much to drink that they were lying around insensible, sleeping, the raiders rushed in and killed the host and all his guests, from lowest of them to the highest. However, they didn't kill everyone, and the bride and the bridegroom were kept alive, so they were put in chains along with many of the nobles, the king's children, daughters, and wife, and any other people who had come there. So they were taken prisoner, and they were subjects of ransom furthermore. However, not all of them were just subjects of ransom, but some of them were collaborating with the Teutons, or at least promised to collaborate, as it was with a Lithuanian who was the former chamberlain to the King of Lithuania, and he was being held prisoner in Belgrade. And he was made to swear on his life that he would deliver the castle at Gardines to the brothers if they would release him from prison. So he made an oath and he promised so. But when he escaped, he betrayed the brothers and he left alongside the Lithuanian king. And the third possible fate that I would like to touch today is, of course, conversion pressures, and it could vary depending on the specific needs. And for instance, the brothers could promise to escape the prisoners of war if they would baptize, as you can see it here, but it didn't always work. However, there were cases when the Lithuanians baptized themselves, and we also have several such cases, although not always it's pretty clear if they were prisoners of war or they were the Lithuanians who just decided to escape or had conflicts in their lands and they just baptized due to some political or some other reasons, as it was in the fragment with Nodam, a Lithuanian who became a Christian and ended his day in the faith, and another pagan Mat, and in fact we do not know exactly his origin, who was baptized and became a member of the order and died as a Christian. So to conclude this brief overview of the issue, it's necessary to emphasize that the Baltic Crusaders, or later the war between the Teutonic Order and Lithuania, produced a significant number of prisoners of war who could be different in terms of their gender, in terms of their age, in terms of their social status, and their treatment varied considerably depending on their status, and the reason for this captivity was mostly dependent on the same thing. And these prisoners held substantial, obviously economic value. They served as laborers or being ransomed. Obviously, many were also subjected to intense pressure to convert, to be baptized. However, in terms of the 13th century, due to the scarcity of sources, the specifics of their treatment remain poorly documented, and in the majority of cases, it's possible to make the parallels from the later period, in particular from the middle of the 14th century onward, when the order began to make many more prisoners, regardless of gender or social status, and killed, in fact, significantly fewer of them, which was explained by political and by economical needs. But this is another story, and we are still in the 13th century for today. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, it will be my pleasure to answer.